dear listener, to Sleepy Story Facts, a slow and soothing sleep story designed to help you settle softly into rest. And tonight, in this gentle bedtime hour, we begin a bedtime story about one of the quiet wonders that is always surrounding you, always holding you, and almost never asking to be noticed: the Earth's atmosphere, that invisible ocean of air resting lightly around the world, rising from meadows and rooftops, from moonlit seas and sleeping cities, up through layers so delicate and vast that they seem less like structure and more like a lullaby made of wind, light, and distance. And before we wander upward together through this relaxing story of sky and science, allow yourself a little time to settle in, to loosen the jaw, to soften the brow, to let the shoulders fall away from the ears, and to feel the weight of your body supported completely. Because there is nowhere to go now, nothing to solve, no need to hold tightly to the day. Only this calm narration, this slow drift into a nighttime story where facts arrive gently and quietly, like feathers landing on still water. And perhaps you notice your breathing, as though you are noticing a small tide, coming in, going out, and with every easy exhale, you may fall asleep a little more fully into comfort, as though the air in your room were reminding the air outside, and the air outside were reminding the whole planet that all living things rest best when they do not rush. The atmosphere begins at the ground where you are, in the troposphere, the lowest layer, the layer of weather and clouds and ordinary life. And it is here that most of the air's mass is gathered, close to Earth, drawn inward by gravity so gently and faithfully that we can live without feeling the tremendous miracle of being wrapped in breathable sky. And in this lower layer, warm air can rise, while cooler air settles, and from this patient movement come breezes, drifting clouds, rainfall, mist, and the kindest forms of weather, the sort that tap softly at windows or move through trees with a sound like whispering pages. And if you imagine standing in an open field at dawn, you can almost sense how the atmosphere behaves like a great quilt, warmed unevenly by sunlight, folded by hills and coastlines, stitched by currents of air too broad, and slow to see all at once. As we continue this sleep story, we rise a little higher, not quickly, never abruptly, but with the soft, floating pace of a dream. And above the troposphere rests the stratosphere, calmer and more layered, where the air is thinner, and where one of the atmosphere's gentlest guardians quietly works, the ozone layer, filtering much of the sun's ultraviolet radiation before it reaches the ground. And there is something deeply comforting in that thought, that high above sleeping forests and darkened villages, there exists a region of rarefied air performing an ancient and protective task, not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily, with the same patience that stars seem to keep over the night. In the stratosphere, temperature begins to rise with height because ozone absorbs solar energy, and even that scientific detail can feel cozy when you think of it as a soft warming from above, a faint brightening in the upper sky. And because this layer is relatively stable, with less vertical mixing than the troposphere below, it can seem almost like a peaceful shelf in the sky, a place where motion becomes smoother, where the restless tumbling of everyday weather gives way to wider and quieter order. Then, drifting onward in our bedtime story, we approach the Mesosphere, higher still, where the air grows colder again. So cold that this region includes some of the chilliest temperatures in the atmosphere, and yet even here, there is a strange serenity. Because many meteors burn up in this layer, their brief bright streaks softened into invisibility long before they could trouble the sleeping world below, as if the atmosphere were not only a blanket, but also a careful gatekeeper, receiving little grains of cosmic dust and turning them into momentary lines of light. Above that waits the Thermosphere, where temperatures can become surprisingly high because the few gas molecules present absorb energetic solar radiation, though the air is so thin there that heat would not feel the way it does near the ground. And in this lofty region, auroras may shimmer near polar skies, green and violet curtains moving in silence, shaped by interactions between charged particles and Earth's magnetic field. And even this is gentle, if imagined from far away, not as spectacle, but as a slow celestial breathing at the edge of space. And farther still is the Exosphere, the outermost fading edge where the atmosphere thins into near emptiness, where individual particles may travel great distances before meeting another, and where the idea of a clear boundary gives way to something softer, a gradual surrender into space, reminding us that nature often prefers gradients to lines, transitions to walls, hush to certainty. Yet for all these beautiful heights, tonight we return lovingly to the lower air, to the weather layer where life listens closely, because gentle weather is one of the atmosphere's sweetest expressions, dew forming when surfaces cool, fog gathering when air reaches saturation near the ground, soft rain condensing from clouds that grew from lifted moist air, and breezes beginning because the sun warms land and sea at different rates, setting the air in motion with such delicacy that an entire coastline can feel it as a daily rhythm, like the inhale and exhale of the planet itself. So as this calming narration carries you toward deep sleep, remember that you are resting inside an elegant structure of layers, currents, vapors, and light, held beneath an atmosphere that shields, warms, cools, lifts, and drifts. And perhaps the most relaxing fact of all is that this immense envelope of air has been moving in graceful patterns around Earth for ages beyond counting, asking nothing from you tonight except that you rest within it, breathe within it, and let its unseen softness help you fall asleep. Continuity log, setting Earth's lower atmosphere at night, beginning on the ground and drifting gently upward through the atmospheric layers. Narrative position, from a quiet resting place at the surface to a dreamlike ascent through troposphere, stratosphere, mesosphere, thermosphere, and exosphere. Story time, opening descent into rest just after the welcome and settling in induction. Now, as this sleep story continues, let us remain for a little while in the troposphere, the nearest and most familiar layer of the atmosphere, where nearly all gentle weather is born, because this is the part of the sky that touches mountains, fields, oceans, rooftops, and sleeping gardens. And it is here that air is always moving in soft and patient ways, carrying warmth, water vapor, and tiny changes of pressure that shape the feeling of a day without ever asking most people to notice them. And perhaps that is what makes the atmosphere such a lovely subject for a bedtime story, because it is powerful but quiet, important but almost invisible, and always around you like a calm companion. And in this relaxing story, we can imagine the air not as empty space, but as a tender fabric made of countless drifting particles, each one participating in a slow and graceful dance. When sunlight warms the ground during the day, the surface passes some of that warmth into the air just above it. And then warmer parcels of air begin to rise because they are less dense than the cooler air nearby. And as they rise, they expand in the lower pressure above, which causes them to cool. And if they cool enough, the water vapor they carry begins to condense onto tiny floating particles, such as dust, salt, or pollen, forming droplets so small and delicate that together they become clouds. And there is something deeply soothing in knowing that a cloud is not a solid thing at all, but a gathering, a soft assembly of countless suspended droplets or ice crystals, held aloft by the same slow-moving atmosphere that now surrounds your room and gently fills your lungs. Some clouds grow in broad and even sheets, like pale blankets spread across the sky, while others rise in rounded towers with sunlit edges and shaded bases. And each shape tells a quiet scientific story about rising air, available moisture, and the stability of the atmosphere. Yet tonight there is no need to study them with urgency, only to drift through them in imagination, noticing how even their names can sound restful: stratus, cirrus, altostratus, nimbostratus, names that move softly across the mind like low music in the distance. And if this nighttime story is doing its work, those words may already be becoming slower and hazier, as though language itself were curling up under a blanket. The atmosphere also speaks through pressure, though not in a voice we hear directly, because air has weight, and all the air above any point on Earth presses downward, creating atmospheric pressure. And when pressure changes from place to place, the air begins to flow from regions of higher pressure toward regions of lower pressure, creating wind. But wind, at its gentlest, is simply the atmosphere trying to even itself out, softly redistributing energy across the world. And that means a breeze passing through leaves, a sea wind arriving at dusk, or a cool draft moving over a meadow can be thought of as part of Earth's endless effort to balance warmth and motion, a planetary exhale too gradual to disturb the sleeping heart. Humidity, too, plays its part in this calming narration, because humidity is simply the amount of water vapor in the air, and warm air can generally hold more water vapor than cool air, which is why evening often brings a different feeling from afternoon, as temperatures fall and the air moves closer to saturation. And if it cools enough, dew may form on grass, petals, railings, and quiet window glass, each bead of moisture appearing so gently that it seems almost dreamed into being. And fog can form in a similar spirit, when air near the ground becomes saturated and a cloud settles low enough to touch the earth itself, blurring distance, softening outlines, and turning familiar places into hushed, and silver worlds. Rain, even in its mildest form, begins in this same patient cycle of lifting, cooling, condensing, and gathering. Because tiny droplets within clouds can collide and combine until they become heavy enough to fall. And what is lovely is that even a simple shower carries within it a whole chain of atmospheric cooperation. Sunlight warming surfaces, air rising, vapor condensing, droplets joining, gravity guiding them home again, and that cycle can repeat endlessly. Ocean to sky, sky to land, land to river, river to sea. A round and restful journey that has been taking place for ages, long before any human ever turned it into science, poetry, or a gentle bedtime tale. As you continue to fall asleep, imagine yourself lying beneath a vast, moving ceiling of cloud and air, safe below it, while above you the atmosphere arranges invisible currents with exquisite care. And consider another relaxing fact: that weather often feels sudden to us only because we are small within it, while the atmosphere itself is usually moving in patterns that unfold across hours, days, and seasons, slowly enough to be traced, mapped, and understood. And this gives weather a kind of hidden kindness, because behind each breeze and drifting cloud is not chaos, but process, not noise, but pattern, not hurry, but flow. And perhaps that is why a sleep story about the sky can be so peaceful, because it reminds us that many things are being carried for us all the time. Warmth is being moved, moisture is being lifted, light is being scattered, and the air itself is quietly tending the world while you rest, inviting you deeper toward deep sleep, toward softer breathing, toward the gentle bedtime, feeling that nothing more is required of you tonight than to be held by the same atmosphere that shapes clouds, softens weather, and wraps the earth in its invisible, faithful embrace. And now, in this soft and unhurried sleep story, as the atmosphere continues to carry us upward in imagination, while keeping us gently connected to the sleeping earth below, we arrive at one of its loveliest and most relaxing wonders: the way air itself shapes light. Because the sky does not truly have a color of its own in the way a flower petal or painted wall might. And yet, by day it appears blue, by sunset it glows gold and rose, and by twilight it deepens into violet hush, all because sunlight is meeting the tiny molecules and particles suspended through the atmosphere. And when light from the sun enters the air, the shorter blue wavelengths are scattered more easily in many directions than the longer red wavelengths, which means that when we look up during the daytime, we are seeing blue light being gently sent across the sky from every side, a fact so simple and so quietly beautiful that it feels perfectly suited to a bedtime story. Because the color above us is not painted on, but softly shared, distributed by air itself, as though the atmosphere were taking sunlight in both hands and diffusing it into something calm enough for human eyes and human thoughts. In the fuller brightness of day, this blue can feel almost endless, especially over open water or broad fields. But as evening comes and the sun sinks lower, its light must travel through more atmosphere before reaching our eyes, and along that longer path, much of the blue light is scattered away from the direct beam, allowing the warmer reds, oranges, and golds to become more visible. And so sunset, that beloved and gentle closing of the day, is in part an atmospheric conversation between distance and light, between path length and color, between the angle of the sun and the patient filtering work of air. And perhaps this is why evening can feel so emotionally soft, because the world is literally being wrapped in warmer tones by the same atmosphere that all day long held clouds aloft, moved breezes through trees, and carried water vapor over the land. There's also a tenderness in twilight itself, that in-between hour when the sun has slipped below the horizon, but its light still lingers in the upper sky. And during this time, the atmosphere continues to scatter and bend sunlight in delicate ways, illuminating layers of air that are still touched by the sun, even while the ground below grows dimmer, so that dusk unfolds gradually rather than all at once. And this slowness feels almost merciful, as though the planet understands that rest is easier when it comes by degrees, when brightness softens rather than snaps away, when one color melts into another, and the mind is invited, not commanded, to let go. Sometimes the evening sky looks especially vivid after the air has gathered fine particles from sea spray, dust, or moisture, because those tiny additions can change how light is scattered and reflected, adding pearly halos, softened glows, or rich orange bands near the horizon. And even this too can be thought of as part of a relaxing story of atmosphere, because nothing in the sky appears alone. Not color, not cloud, not haze, not silver moonlight. All of it is shaped by relationships, by air meeting light, by water meeting temperature, by height meeting angle, by the world's invisible layer, continuously translating the sun's brilliance into forms gentle enough for evening eyes. If you imagine yourself now resting beneath a quiet sky after sunset, perhaps with a window slightly open, or with the memory of cool air brushing your face, you may notice how naturally this nighttime story leans toward deep sleep, because the atmosphere is always reducing harshness for us, filtering some radiation above, scattering glare into softness below, and stretching the departure of daylight into a long and tranquil farewell. And there is comfort in knowing that the sky's beauty is not decoration alone, but a result of physical processes so steady and dependable that they happen every clear morning and every calm evening, whether or not anyone stops to name them. Even the pale colors before sunrise belong to this same patient science, for dawn, like dusk, begins while the sun is still below the horizon, when its light reaches the upper atmosphere first, and then gradually brightens the lower sky. And so morning does not arrive as a sudden event, but as a quiet layering, dim blue to silver, silver to peach, peach to soft gold. And in that slow arrival, there is a rhythm that mirrors breathing itself, making this calming narration feel less like invention and more like companionship with the world as it really is. And perhaps one of the most soothing facts of all is that every person who has ever watched the sky grow blue or pink has been witnessing the atmosphere performing this same gentle work, this same elegant scattering, this same light-filled kindness over deserts and villages, forests and rooftops, over ships at sea and quiet towns at the edge of mountains. And tonight, as you continue to fall asleep, you are still beneath that same protective and luminous blanket of air. A blanket that turns sunlight into blue noon, turns evening into amber calm, and turns the fading edge of day into one long invitation to rest, soften, and drift until the mind itself becomes like twilight, spacious, dim, and beautifully at peace. As this sleep story continues, let us rest for a while in one of the atmosphere's most peaceful rhythms, the way air becomes warmer or cooler as it moves through the sky. Because the atmosphere is never simply still, even on the quietest night, and yet its changes are often so gradual, so smooth, and so delicately balanced that they feel more like breathing than motion. And perhaps that is why this bedtime story can be so soothing, because it reminds us that even temperature, which seems so ordinary when we mention it in passing, is part of a vast and tender arrangement of sunlight, land, water, height, and time. Near the ground, the air is warmed mostly from below, because sunlight heats Earth's surface first, and then the surface shares that warmth with the air just above it, which means that as we move upward through the lower atmosphere, the temperature usually falls, little by little, in a pattern known as the lapse rate. And there is something wonderfully calming in that phrase, lapse rate, as though the warmth is not vanishing at all, only gently thinning, like music fading down a hallway, or lamplight softening through layers of evening mist. This cooling with height helps explain why mountain air can feel fresher and cooler than the air below, why snow may linger on high peaks long after valleys have turned green, and why clouds so often gather when rising air expands and cools enough for water vapor to condense. And if you picture all of this in the spirit of a relaxing story, it is easy to imagine the atmosphere as a quiet stairway of temperatures, each step slightly different from the last, each one part of a slow and elegant transition from the lived-in world below to the thinner stillness above. Yet the atmosphere is gentle, not only in its patterns, but also in its exceptions. And one of the most interesting exceptions is the temperature inversion, a soft rearrangement in which a layer of warmer air rests above cooler air near the surface, creating a kind of lid in the sky that can reduce vertical mixing for a time. And though the word inversion may sound technical, the feeling of it can be deeply serene to imagine, especially on a calm night when the ground loses heat after sunset. The air nearest the surface cools, and the world grows still beneath a quiet cap of warmer air, as if the night itself had tucked the lower landscape under a smooth, atmospheric blanket. In valleys, this can be especially noticeable because cool air, being denser, may drift downslope and settle in lower places, collecting there with the patience of water finding a basin. And from this simple behavior come some of the softest scenes in nature: pale dawn fog resting in hollows, frosty fields silvering before sunrise, and mornings that feel gently hushed because the air has spent the night organizing itself in layers too subtle for most eyes to notice, and too beautiful for a sleepy mind not to love. Along coasts, the story becomes even more tender because land and water warm and cool at different rates, with land changing temperature more quickly and the sea responding more slowly. And from that quiet difference come sea breezes by day and land breezes by night. Small circulations that feel less like weather events and more like the pulse of a shoreline, the atmosphere answering the contrast between sand and water with a steady and comforting exchange of air. In mountainous regions, there are similar patterns where valley breezes may flow upslope in daytime as the sun warms the land, and mountain breezes may drift downslope after dark as the surface cools. And in this way, the atmosphere listens closely to the shape of the world, moving in response to hills, ridges, forests, lakes, and plains, never fully separate from the earth below, always in conversation with it, always translating landscape into motion. This is one of the loveliest scientific facts to carry into deep sleep, that air is not only above us, but in relationship with everything it touches, with every dark river winding through a plain, every meadow storing warmth, every stone path cooling after sunset, and every sleeping garden releasing the memory of the day back into the night, a little at a time. Even indoors, in the stillness where you now rest, you are connected to these wider atmospheric rhythms, because the breath you take is part of the same great envelope of air that drifts over oceans, brushes against mountain snow, rises above sunlit fields, and settles softly into valleys before dawn. And perhaps the most calming thought of all is that the atmosphere does not hurry any of this. It does not rush the cooling of evening. It does not force the lifting of morning air. It simply responds, adjusts, balances, and continues, making this nighttime story feel less like an escape from the world and more like a quiet return to its gentlest truths. So as you fall asleep, imagine the earth beneath its layers of air, slowly turning, slowly cooling in some places and warming in others, while above and around it, the atmosphere performs its patient work of rising, sinking, spreading, and settling. And let that image become a kind of gentle bedtime cradle for the mind, a calm narration of temperatures drifting by degrees, of breezes born from difference and softened by distance, of valleys filling with coolness and shorelines breathing in rhythm, until thought itself becomes lighter, slower, and more willing to rest in the same soft, serialized style established by your sample script. We continue this gentle journey upward tonight, letting the sleep story drift from the weather-filled lower sky into calmer heights where the atmosphere becomes smoother, quieter, and somehow even more serene. Above the familiar troposphere, where clouds gather and rain softly forms, there is a boundary called the tropopause, a kind of atmospheric threshold, and crossing it in imagination feels like rising above the murmur of a busy house into a silent upper room. Because here, the lively vertical mixing of the lower air begins to fade, and the stratosphere opens above like a vast and peaceful chamber of blue stillness, a layer so broad and delicate that it seems made not only of air, but of patience itself. In this bedtime story, there is no hurry in the ascent, only the quiet sense of leaving behind the drifting weather of the lower world and entering a region where the air is thinner the sky deepens, and the motion of the atmosphere becomes more layered than tumbling, more gliding than turning. And this is one of the most relaxing facts about Earth's atmosphere, that not every part of it is restless, not every region is filled with swirling change, because some layers exist in a calmer arrangement, like carefully folded fabric resting high above the sleeping planet. The stratosphere is special because, unlike the lower atmosphere, where temperature usually falls with height, here the temperature begins to rise again as you go upward. And it does so for a gentle and beautiful reason, for in this region, the ozone layer quietly absorbs much of the sun's ultraviolet radiation, warming the surrounding air and offering life below a kind of invisible guardianship. And perhaps this is one of the most comforting images in all of atmospheric science, that far above forests, cities, oceans, and moonlit roofs, there is a thin, protective region doing its work without applause, filtering, shielding, and glowing faintly in the language of physics, while the world below sleeps. Ozone itself is simply a form of oxygen made of 3 oxygen atoms instead of the usual 2. And though the chemistry is precise, the feeling of it in this relaxing story is tender, almost lullaby-like, because it reminds us that even tiny molecular differences can shape the comfort of an entire world, and that sometimes safety arrives not in grand gestures, but in quiet layers spread thinly across great distances, because the stratosphere is more stable than the troposphere, with warmer air often resting above cooler air and reducing the kind of vertical mixing that drives ordinary weather. Clouds are rarer here, and the air can feel almost contemplative in the imagination, as though the atmosphere has taken a long, slow breath and decided to hold it in perfect calm. And for a listener easing toward deep sleep, that stability can become a soothing image, a place above the cloud tops where turbulence softens, where motions lengthen into broad currents, and where the earth below seems tucked under a smooth and luminous coverlet of air. Sometimes, in this high layer, delicate clouds called polar stratospheric clouds can form in very cold conditions, shimmering with pale colors and subtle iridescence. And even though they belong to special regions and special circumstances, they seem to fit naturally into a nighttime story like this, because they are not the loud, dramatic clouds of a storm, but rather rare and fragile veils that appear like pearl dust suspended in the upper sky. There is also something calming in the knowledge that high-altitude jet aircraft sometimes travel in the lower stratosphere or near its edge, not because this layer is busy, but because it can offer smoother air above much of the changing weather below. And even that practical fact carries a sleepy kind of poetry, suggesting that human beings, when they rise into the sky, often seek the same thing we seek at bedtime: a quieter layer, a gentler passage, a little less bump, and a little more stillness. And so, as this bedtime story unfolds, imagine yourself floating in thought above the cloud deck, not in cold emptiness, but in a tranquil region where the sky darkens toward a deeper blue, where the sunlight is cleaner and more direct, where the ozone keeps its patient watch, and where the atmosphere feels less like weather and more like architecture, a high and elegant structure of warmth, gas, light, and protection arranged around the Earth with extraordinary care. Below, the troposphere continues its work with rain and fog, and sea breezes and dew. But up here in this calming narration, the mood is smoother, almost hushed, as though the planet has entered a quieter verse of the same song. And perhaps that is why the Stratosphere belongs so naturally in a gentle bedtime tale, because it teaches that the sky has layers of temperament as well as layers of air, and that above the changing and stirring world, there are places of remarkable steadiness, places where warmth increases not from fire or friction, but from sunlight being softly received and transformed. Let that thought rest with you now as you fall asleep, that the Earth is held not by a single simple shell, but by a beautifully structured atmosphere whose layers each have their own character, their own purpose, their own way of tending the world. And tonight, we are drifting through one of its calmest regions, the still blue heights of the Stratosphere, where protection is quiet, where motion is measured, and where the invisible air above your resting body continues its ancient and gentle work beneath the stars, inviting you farther into deep sleep, farther into softness, and farther into the peaceful feeling that you, too, are safely held inside a vast and silent design, continuing in the same slow, soothing, serialized rhythm established earlier. We rise a little farther tonight, leaving the still blue heights of the Stratosphere and drifting into the Mesosphere, a colder and more distant layer of Earth's atmosphere that feels, in this gentle bedtime telling, less like a place of harshness and more like a silent silver hall above the weather, above the clouds, above the pathways of ordinary birds and aircraft, where the air grows so thin and the cold so deep that the sky itself begins to feel like a long exhale stretched between the Earth and space. And yet, even here, the atmosphere remains faithful, still doing its quiet work, still wrapping the planet in subtle protection, still offering one more soft chapter in this relaxing story for those who wish to fall asleep beneath the thought of a world lovingly surrounded by air. The Mesosphere lies above the Stratosphere, and unlike the warming pattern below in the ozone-rich heights, here the temperature falls again as altitude increases, until this layer becomes one of the coldest regions in the atmosphere. And there is something strangely calming in that fact, because the cold here is not the biting cold of wind on skin, not the sudden cold of stepping outdoors without a coat, but a vast and distant atmospheric coolness, too high to touch you directly, too remote to disturb your rest. And so it becomes less a discomfort and more a feeling, a serene idea of upper air growing quieter and more rarefied as it rises farther from the warmed world below. In this nighttime story, the Mesosphere can be imagined as a region of hush, where the last familiar traces of the lower atmosphere begin to fade, and where the Earth below seems wrapped in layers of increasing softness. And yet this high, cold layer is not empty of purpose, because many meteors, those tiny grains of cosmic dust and rock that enter Earth's atmosphere at tremendous speed, meet the Mesosphere first in any meaningful way, and there, through friction with the sparse but still present air, they heat and glow, becoming the brief streaks of light we call shooting stars. Though most are not stars at all, only little visitors from space, made luminous for a moment by the atmosphere's gentle but persistent resistance. This is one of the most comforting scientific facts of the night sky, that what appears to us as a fleeting bright line over a sleeping field or dark rooftop is often the atmosphere quietly receiving and dissolving tiny fragments from beyond the earth, turning them into beauty before they can travel farther. And when thought of in that way, even a meteor becomes part of a bedtime story, not an intrusion, but a soft and passing note in the great lullaby of sky and planet. Sometimes, in the upper reaches of the Mesosphere, there can also appear rare and delicate noctilucent clouds so high and so fine that they may still catch sunlight after the ground has fallen into darkness, glowing pale blue or silver near the horizon in deep twilight. And these are among the most dreamlike sights the atmosphere can offer, for they seem almost impossible. Bright clouds in a darkened sky, like a last whisper of day held carefully in the highest cold. And perhaps that is why they belong so naturally in a calming narration such as this one, because they remind us that the atmosphere is full of subtle transitions and tender exceptions, little pockets of wonder that reward the patient and the sleepy-minded alike. The Mesosphere is difficult for human machines to explore directly, too high for most aircraft and weather balloons, too low for the easy, sustained orbits of many satellites, and because of that, it has sometimes been called one of the less visited layers of the atmosphere, which gives it a further sense of stillness in the imagination, as though it were a quiet middle chamber in the sky, passed through, but not often lingered in, a place that keeps its distance and preserves its silence. Yet even if people do not often dwell there, the Mesosphere remains deeply connected to life below, because it is part of the same grand atmospheric structure that scatters blue daylight, carries cloud and rain, filters harmful radiation, and shapes the very softness of the sky above a resting earth. And perhaps that is the most soothing truth of all, that no layer stands alone, no height is separate from the whole, but each region of air belongs to continuous and elegant design, each one contributing in its own quiet way to the sheltering of the world. So now, as this sleep story drifts onward and your thoughts grow slower, imagine the Mesosphere spread above you like an immense, dark, and peaceful sea of cold upper air, where meteors bloom and vanish in silence, where rare luminous clouds may shimmer at the edge of night, and where the atmosphere, even in its remoteness, continues to keep watch with a patience older than memory. And let that image soothe you, this high and silent layer doing its work without sound, without hurry, without asking to be seen, while you rest below in safety, breathing gently, sinking gradually toward deep sleep, held by a planet that is itself held by the soft and faithful architecture of air. Now, as this sleep story continues its slow and velvety ascent, we rise beyond the cold silver quiet of the Mesosphere and enter the Thermosphere, a layer so high and so thin that it seems almost less like air and more like the memory of air, a fading extension of Earth's atmosphere where particles drift far apart, where sunlight arrives with a clearer and more energetic touch, and where the planet's unseen boundary with space begins to feel wonderfully soft around the edges. And yet, even here, in this lofty region beyond clouds and common weather, there is no sharpness in our bedtime story, no harshness to disturb the mind. Only the gentle feeling of floating above the turning earth, while the atmosphere continues its patient work in ways that are quiet, subtle, and deeply beautiful. The thermosphere is a place of seeming contradiction, because although temperatures there can become extremely high when measured in scientific terms, the air is so incredibly thin that it would not feel hot in the familiar way it does near the ground, and that makes it perfect for a relaxing story like this one, because it reminds us that the atmosphere is full of truths that become softer and stranger the more calmly we observe them. And here the idea of warmth changes from a feeling on the skin into a dance of fast-moving particles touched by strong sunlight. Far above the meadows, rooftops, and sleeping shorelines we left below, in this high region, the sun's radiation is absorbed by sparse atoms and molecules, giving them energy and causing part of the thermosphere to overlap with a zone called the ionosphere, where particles can become electrically charged. And though those words may sound technical in daylight, tonight they arrive like lullaby words: ionosphere, thermosphere, charged particles, each one a small lantern in the mind, glowing gently without asking to be fully understood, because what matters in this nighttime story is not effort, but atmosphere, not mastering every detail, but feeling the calm wonder of a world wrapped in invisible layers that keep unfolding into new forms of beauty. One of the most soothing wonders of the thermosphere is the aurora. Those soft curtains of green, pink, violet, and pale white that sometimes ripple across high-latitude skies when charged particles from the sun meet Earth's magnetic field and interact with gases in the upper atmosphere. And if there is any perfect image for calming narration, it may be this one: the idea of silent light moving like silk across the dark, folding and unfolding without sound, without hurry, without heat, like the sky itself dreaming in color while the earth sleeps below. Imagine lying under such a sky, perhaps in a still northern landscape where snow, sea, or stone reflects a little of that green glow. And above you, the thermosphere is not distant in any lonely way, but tenderly present, transforming invisible energy into visible softness, receiving particles from the sun and turning them into slow, luminous veils. And suddenly, even space begins to feel gentle, not empty, but hushed, not vast in a frightening sense, but spacious in the way. A darkened room is spacious when one small lamp is left on in the corner. Satellites and space stations travel through the lower reaches of this region, moving in graceful paths around the Earth, and even that can be folded into the comfort of a bedtime story, because it means that high above the ordinary, whether above the drifting clouds and sunset colors, there are human-made companions circling quietly through the upper atmosphere, carried by motion, gravity, and the soft geometry of orbital pathways, while beneath them, the atmosphere continues to thin and shimmer and absorb sunlight in delicate ways. Yet, for all its altitude, the thermosphere remains connected to everything below, to the blue of daytime skies, to the rain-bearing clouds of the troposphere, to the ozone-guarded calm of the stratosphere, to the meteor-lit silence of the mesosphere. And this continuity is one of the most relaxing facts of all, that Earth's atmosphere is not a stack of separate places, but a flowing whole, each layer touching the next, each region part of the same great protective envelope, surrounding the planet with astonishing grace. As you continue to fall asleep, let your mind drift through that thought, through the image of auroras wavering in silence, through the idea of thin, high air carrying traces of sunlight and charge, through the feeling of the earth below turning gently beneath this immense and nearly invisible architecture. And allow this gentle bedtime chapter to soften the edges of wakefulness a little more, because nothing in the thermosphere needs you to hold it tightly. Nothing here asks for analysis or effort, only a quiet kind of noticing, only the soft acceptance that even at the edge of space, the atmosphere remains beautiful, purposeful, and calm. And perhaps that is the secret gift of this relaxing story, that the higher we drift, the more the world seems to simplify into light, motion, silence, and care, until the mind, like the upper air itself, becomes spacious and clear, ready for deep sleep, ready to float for a while in a peaceful darkness, touched only by the faintest whisper of color. And now, very softly, this sleep story rises to the outermost whisper of Earth's atmosphere, to the Exosphere, that delicate and fading region where the sky does not end with a line, but slowly loosens into space, and where the atmosphere becomes so thin that individual particles may drift for long distances before meeting another, like quiet travelers crossing a vast and nearly silent sea. And in this bedtime story, that fading edge feels not lonely, but peaceful, not empty, but spacious in the gentlest possible way, as though the planet were wrapped in one final translucent veil that grows lighter and lighter until it is almost indistinguishable from the darkness beyond. Here, far above clouds and weather, above the blue scattering of daylight and the silver shimmer of auroras, the air is mostly made of the lightest particles, especially hydrogen and helium, because at these extreme heights, the atmosphere becomes so rare that the smallest and swiftest atoms can wander with remarkable freedom. And this is one of the most relaxing facts about Earth's atmosphere, that even at its highest reach, it does not stop abruptly or close itself like a door, but instead opens gradually, softly, and with extraordinary patience, as though nature prefers lullabies to endings and transitions to boundaries. In the Exosphere, gravity still holds the atmosphere to Earth, but only gently. And if you imagine that pull not as force, but as a kind of faithful invitation, the whole region begins to feel like a quiet conversation between planet and sky, with Earth below turning steadily in darkness and light, and the faintest outer air lingering near it, never quite lost, never quite still, suspended in a balance so subtle that it seems almost dreamlike. This is a beautiful thought to carry into deep sleep, because so much of life feels full of edges and deadlines and firm borders, while the atmosphere reminds us that some of the most important things are gradual, nearly invisible, and tenderly continuous, and that even the meeting place between Earth and space is not harsh when seen through calm narration, but soft as breath fading into cool night air. Satellites often travel through this upper region or near it, circling the planet in paths so smooth and steady that they seem to belong naturally to the hush of the Exosphere. And perhaps that too can become part of this relaxing story, the idea of quiet companions moving above the sleeping world, not disturbing the stillness, only gliding through it, while continents drift slowly below them into day, and then back again into night. From here, the whole atmosphere we have traveled through in imagination feels like a layered cradle around the Earth, with the troposphere carrying clouds, rain, mist, and breezes, the stratosphere holding its stable blue calm and protective ozone, the mesosphere receiving meteors in silver silence, the thermosphere glowing with auroral light, and now the exosphere resting at the farthest edge, like the final sheer fold of a celestial blanket. And when thought of this way, the atmosphere becomes not only a scientific wonder, but a gentle bedtime architecture, a many-layered shelter surrounding every forest, ocean, desert, mountain, rooftop, and sleeping room on the planet. Perhaps the most soothing part of this nighttime story is the way these layers remain with us, whether or not we think about them during the day. Because the atmosphere is always there, filtering, scattering, warming, cooling, holding, and protecting in 1,000 quiet ways. And even now, as you lie still and begin to fall asleep more deeply, it continues its ancient and delicate work above you, from the air nearest your resting breath to the outermost particles drifting at the edge of near space. And if your thoughts have become lighter by now, if they have started to drift as the exosphere drifts, then let them do so without resistance, because this region teaches a peaceful lesson that things do not always need to stop in order to become calm. They can simply grow softer, thinner, wider, and more spacious. And in that spaciousness, the mind can unclench, the body can feel safely held, and the long arc of wakefulness can finally give way to rest. So imagine the earth below as a quiet blue sphere wrapped in layers of air, so fine and beautiful that even science, for all its precision, seems to speak of them with a kind of reverence. And imagine yourself suspended not in effort, not in noise, but in a vast and gentle design, while above the weather and above the lights of cities, the exosphere extends outward like the faintest echo of breath on a winter window, barely visible, already vanishing, and yet still present, still connected, still part of the whole. Let this calming narration become slower now, softer now, as though the words themselves were thinning into the upper air. And let this gentle bedtime chapter carry you toward the quietest part of night, where thought loosens, where breathing deepens, and where the atmosphere, from ground to starlit edge, continues to hold the world in a silence so complete and so kind that it feels made for sleep, continuing in the same long-form, calming serialized style established for this project. We drift onward into the next atmospheric chapter with the same gentle pace and bedtime softness. From the fading quiet of the exosphere, Let us now begin the slowest and most restful kind of descent, not falling, not hurrying, only gliding back in imagination through the layered sky toward the familiar nearness of Earth. And as we do, we turn our attention to one of the atmosphere's most constant and tender gifts, the soft pressure of air itself, the invisible weight that surrounds every mountain, every shoreline, every sleeping town, and every resting body. And although pressure may sound like something forceful in ordinary conversation, in the atmosphere, it is one of the gentlest facts of all, because it is simply the presence of air above you, held by Earth's gravity in a vast and delicate envelope, pressing evenly and quietly in all directions, so steadily that most of the time you do not notice it at all. And perhaps that unnoticed kindness is what makes it so perfect for a sleep story, because the atmosphere supports life not by demanding attention, but by carrying on faithfully in the background, hour after hour, night after night. If you imagine the atmosphere as an ocean made not of water, but of air, then pressure becomes easy to feel in the mind, because just as water presses more strongly at greater depths, the atmosphere is densest and most pressurized near the surface, where the full column of air rests above. And then, little by little, that pressure decreases with height, which means that every step upward through the sky brings a subtle lightening, a slight thinning, a slow release. And this gradual change is one of the reasons the atmosphere feels so beautifully layered, because it is not arranged in sudden shelves, but in smooth transitions, each one easing into the next, like the changing colors of evening. Near sea level, where most human lives unfold, the air is rich enough in oxygen and steady enough in pressure to make breathing feel effortless when all is calm. And even that ordinary breath becomes more comforting when you remember that it is part of a planetary exchange, a small and rhythmic participation in the lower atmosphere, where lungs receive what forests release, where oceans contribute moisture, where winds distribute warmth, and where the chemistry of the air remains balanced closely enough for billions of quiet inhalations and exhalations to take place every day without ceremony. There is something deeply soothing in thinking of breath this way, not as something you must manage tonight, but as something the earth has prepared for you, something the atmosphere has been offering all along, a blend of gases arranged with extraordinary precision and remarkable gentleness, mostly nitrogen, then oxygen, and smaller amounts of argon, carbon dioxide, water vapor, and trace gases, all held in proportions that make the world livable and the night itself breathable. As this bedtime story continues, imagine lying peacefully while the atmosphere rests above you in layers, each one contributing to the comfort of the whole. And remember that pressure is also part of weather's softer language, because when pressure changes from place to place, the air begins to move. And from those differences come breezes, drifting fronts, clear spells, and rain-bearing systems. Yet even these changes often begin in subtle ways, with broad regions of rising or sinking air, with temperatures shifting gradually over land and sea, with invisible contours stretching across maps like the smooth lines of a lullaby written over the world. High-pressure systems often bring calmer skies and more settled conditions because sinking air tends to suppress the formation of large clouds, while lower pressure can encourage air to rise, cool, and condense, creating more cloudiness and precipitation. And though meteorology can describe these patterns with charts and numbers, there is also a bedtime softness in their meaning, because the sky is always seeking balance, always redistributing energy and moisture in slow, sweeping motions, always adjusting itself with more patience than urgency. You might imagine a quiet, high-pressure evening over a wide plain where the air is still, the stars are clear, and the cooling ground slowly releases the memory of the day into the dark. Or a gentle, low-pressure morning where clouds gather like pale wool and light rain moves over rooftops with no drama at all, only steadiness, only a soft tapping that seems to draw blankets a little higher. Even storms, which we will treat only gently in this relaxing story, begin from the same basic atmospheric truths, from pressure differences, rising air, moisture, and the transfer of heat. And this means that the sky is never random in the deepest sense, only dynamic, only responsive, only engaged in a patient conversation between sun, surface, and air. And perhaps the most calming fact of all tonight is that your own body lives in harmony with this soft pressure without requiring your attention. Your ears, lungs, circulation, and senses all quietly adapted to the atmosphere that holds you, so that rest becomes possible inside a world already shaped for it. Let that thought settle around you now like a second blanket. The idea that the air in your room, the night outside your window, and the vast atmosphere above the continents and oceans are all part of one continuous and sheltering whole, pressing lightly, balancing endlessly, breathing with the planet in ways so ancient and so dependable that you do not need to do anything but receive them. And as this calming narration drifts lower through the sky once more, let your own breathing become softer, slower, and easier, until pressure is no longer a scientific word at all, but simply the invisible kindness of being held, continuing in the same slow, soothing long-form rhythm established for this project, and keeping faith with the calm bedtime cadence suggested by your sample. We move into the next chapter with unhurried softness and steady atmospheric wonder. As this sleep story drifts onward, let us remain within the lower reaches of Earth's atmosphere and listen to one of its oldest and quietest conversations, the making of wind, because wind at its gentlest is simply air responding to difference, air moving from one place to another as the planet warms unevenly beneath the sun. And when imagined in the stillness of night, it does not feel like force at all, but like a slow intelligence, a patient adjustment, a soft rebalancing of warmth and pressure across oceans, plains, forests, and sleeping cities. During the day, sunlight does not warm every part of Earth in exactly the same way, because dark soil, pale sand, open water, mountain rock, and leafy valleys all absorb and release heat differently, and from those differences arise tiny shifts in temperature and pressure that invite the air to move, so that what you might feel as a breeze against a curtain or hear as a hush in the trees is really part of a planetary pattern far wider and calmer than any one moment suggests. Some winds are local and intimate, born along coastlines where land warms more quickly than water by day and cools more quickly by night. And these sea breezes and land breezes move with a kind of domestic tenderness, arriving and departing as faithfully as tides of air, while other winds belong to larger belts of circulation that stretch across continents and oceans, turning slowly with the rotating earth and tracing broad pathways through the troposphere like ribbons laid gently around the world. Near the equator, where sunlight is most direct on average, warm air rises more readily, and as it rises and spreads poleward aloft, cooler air eventually sinks in subtropical regions before returning near the surface in great circulating patterns. And this graceful exchange is part of what scientists describe as global circulation. Yet tonight it may be easier to picture it as the breathing of the planet. Warm air rising like a sigh, cooler air settling like a blanket being drawn smooth, each movement connected to another in a rhythm too vast to hear, yet calm enough to imagine. Because Earth rotates, these broad movements do not travel in perfectly straight lines, but are gently deflected in a way that helps shape the trade winds, the westerlies, and the polar easterlies, and though such names might sound technical in daylight, in a relaxing story, they can become almost musical. Trade winds drifting steadily across tropical oceans, westerlies guiding weather patterns through the middle latitudes, polar easterlies brushing the cold edges of the world, all of them part of a serene atmospheric choreography that continues whether anyone is awake to study it or not. There's something deeply restful in knowing that the atmosphere does not improvise wildly from moment to moment, but follows recurring patterns shaped by sunlight, rotation, land, sea, and season. And this means that even the wandering of wind contains structure, memory, and balance, as though the sky itself has learned over long ages how to move with grace. Jet streams, those narrow bands of stronger wind high in the upper troposphere and lower stratosphere, also belong to this larger story, flowing in long curving paths where sharp temperature contrasts help organize the air. And though they are swifter than the breezes near the ground, we can still hold them gently in the mind, not as something fierce, but as distant rivers in the sky, guiding weather systems with elegant persistence, while far below, a quiet room remains still enough for deep sleep. In valleys and hills, the wind may soften and change character again, bending around slopes, slipping through passes, slowing in sheltered places, and freshening over open ridges. And this local intimacy is one of the atmosphere's kindest qualities, that even global patterns are willing to adapt to the shape of the land, to listen to topography, to flow not only across the earth, but with it. Imagine now a meadow just before dawn, where the night air is cool and barely moving, and beyond it, a coastline where a marine breeze will return with daylight, and farther still an ocean crossed by trade winds that have blown in one form or another for ages, carrying warmth, moisture, and the faint salt memory of distant waves, and all of it joined in one continuous system of motion, so broad and soft that it can cradle an entire world without ever seeming hurried. This is why a bedtime story about the atmosphere can be such a gentle bedtime companion, because it reminds us that movement does not have to mean disturbance, that travel does not have to mean strain, and that even the air itself can wander with a kind of calm purpose, seeking balance, sharing warmth, guiding clouds, and smoothing the edges of weather. So as this calming narration continues, and you begin to fall asleep more fully, let your thoughts drift like those winds, not racing, not clinging, only moving lightly through a spacious inner sky. And let the fact settle over you that all around the sleeping earth, from equatorial calm to polar hush, from sea breeze to jet stream, the atmosphere is forever arranging itself in patterns, both scientific and soothing, a vast invisible circulation, carrying comfort, quiet, and continuity through the nighttime story of the world, continuing in the same slow, serialized bedtime style suggested by your sample script. We return tonight to the softer weather of the lower atmosphere, where clouds gather, mist settles, and rain begins with extraordinary patience. As this sleep story goes on, let us drift lower through the troposphere once more, into the familiar and tender layer of air where weather touches the earth most closely. Because here the atmosphere is not distant or abstract, not a high and hidden structure beyond human feeling, but something intimate, something that rests against windows, moves through trees, softens the outlines of hills, and leaves silver beads of water on grass before dawn. And perhaps nowhere is its quiet artistry more beautiful than in the making of rain and mist, which begin not with suddenness, but with tiny changes so delicate that they seem almost like the atmosphere thinking in whispers. Water vapor, invisible and weightless in appearance, rises into the air from oceans, rivers, lakes, wet soil, and leaves. And this process of evaporation is one of the planet's gentlest exchanges, a lifting of moisture from the surface into the sky, as though the earth were exhaling softly all day long. And once that vapor is held in the atmosphere, it travels with the air until conditions become cool enough for it to condense. And when that happens, the unseen becomes visible. The air reveals its hidden moisture, and a cloud, a veil of fog, or the first small droplets of rain begin to form. But condensation does not usually happen in emptiness alone, because tiny particles in the air, bits of dust, salt, smoke, pollen, or other microscopic matter, often provide surfaces for water vapor to gather upon. And there is something deeply calming in that fact, that even the smallest floating speck can become a resting place for moisture, a little center around which a droplet may grow. And in this way, the atmosphere teaches a quiet lesson that softness often gathers around the tiniest things, and that great blankets of cloud can begin with almost invisible invitations. In this relaxing story, imagine cool evening air settling over a meadow after sunset, the ground slowly releasing the warmth it held during the day, the temperature near the surface slipping gently downward until the nearby air reaches its dew point, that calm threshold where moisture begins to condense. And then, almost imperceptibly, dew appears on leaves, on stone, on petals, on the dark rail of a garden fence, not falling from above, not arriving with sound, but assembling itself silently out of the air. And if the cooling deepens or the moisture is abundant enough, fog may form as well, a cloud at ground level, a pale softening of distance that turns fields and roads and sleeping houses into shapes of hush and silver. Fog is one of the atmosphere's most restful creations because it does not rush, it muffles, it simplifies, it eases the world into gentler outlines. And whether it forms by the cooling of air near the ground, by warm, moist air moving over a cooler surface, or by the mixing of different air masses, it always seems to carry a message of quiet, as if the atmosphere were drawing a light curtain across the land to help it rest. Rain, too, begins with tenderness long before it is heard on rooftops, because within clouds, tiny droplets move and mingle, colliding and joining, until some grow large enough that the air can no longer keep them suspended. And then gravity, that patient companion of all atmospheric motion, begins to guide them downward. And what reaches the earth as drizzle or soft rain is the final chapter of a much longer story involving evaporation, uplift, cooling, condensation, growth, and descent. A cycle so old and so steady that it has lulled forests, rivers, and sleeping mines for ages beyond counting. Sometimes rain is especially gentle when droplets are small and numerous, falling in a fine and even pattern that seems to erase the hard edges of thought. And sometimes it begins as a thicker cloud-dark softness in the distance before moving overhead. But in this bedtime telling, we stay close only to the mild and comforting forms, the kind of rain that taps lightly at a window, darkens the soil with no urgency, and leaves the air afterward feeling washed, fragrant, and clear. Even the smell that sometimes follows rain, that cool, earthy sweetness rising from ground and stone, can feel like part of the atmosphere's lullaby, a reminder that air and land are always in conversation, always passing moisture and memory between them. And all of this belongs to the same invisible ocean of sky that has held us since the beginning of this nighttime story. So as you continue to fall asleep, picture the lower atmosphere at work with exquisite patience, lifting water from sea and leaf, carrying it as vapor through the air, gathering it into cloud, lowering it as mist, placing it as dew, and returning it as rain, not in haste, never in harshness, but with a steadiness so soft that it can be heard as comfort. And let your thoughts follow that cycle now, rising, cooling, gathering, and gently settling until the mind itself becomes like evening fog over a quiet field, light, slow, and ready to disappear into deep sleep, continuing in the same ultra-calm, long-form bedtime rhythm established for this project. This sleep story now settles even closer to the sleeping earth, where the atmosphere performs some of its smallest and most tender miracles in the quiet hours before dawn. As this gentle bedtime chapter unfolds, imagine the world growing still beneath a clear night sky, the air calm over gardens and fields and rooftops, the warmth of the day slowly drifting away from stones, leaves, and wooden fences until the ground begins to cool more quickly than the air above it. And in that simple and beautiful difference, the atmosphere begins another of its soft arrangements. Because when surfaces lose enough heat, the nearby air can also cool, and if it cools to the point where its moisture can no longer remain invisible, tiny droplets begin to appear, not with sound, not with urgency, but with a patience so complete that dew seems less like weather and more like a blessing placed delicately upon the land. This is one of the most relaxing facts in all the atmosphere, that water can gather out of air so quietly that a meadow may go to sleep dry and wake silvered. Each blade of grass holding a small round world of reflected moonlight, each petal resting beneath a clear bead so perfect it seems almost imagined. And in this nighttime story, dew becomes a reminder that the atmosphere is always carrying more than we see, more moisture, more softness, more hidden potential for calm transformation than daylight usually allows us to notice. When the air is moist and the night is gentle, dew forms because the temperature of the surface falls to the dew point, that peaceful threshold where water vapor condenses into liquid. And if you picture that process slowly, as though the earth itself were breathing out coolness while the sky watches over it, then even science begins to feel like lullaby language, because condensation is simply the moment when the invisible chooses to rest in visible form. Sometimes this happens first on smooth car roofs, on window panes, on broad leaves, or on quiet garden stones, because some surfaces cool more quickly than others. And this is another soft truth about the atmosphere, that even in one small place, one small backyard or field or village lane, the night air is in conversation with every texture beneath it, with metal, soil, wood, flower, and glass, responding gently to each. And when the night grows colder still, when the surface temperature slips below freezing, the atmosphere offers a different kind of tenderness, because frost can form, not as rain frozen after falling, but often as water vapor moving directly into delicate crystals of ice upon the cold ground. And there is something so calm and hushed about that process that it feels perfectly made for a relaxing story to fall asleep to. For frost does not arrive loudly. It does not rush in. It simply appears, feather by feather, edge by edge, until fields, branches, and rooftops wear a pale lace of white in the early dawn, before the first strong sunlight touches the land. Frost can make the ordinary world seem newly ceremonial, as though the atmosphere had spent the night embroidering each surface with fine silver stitching. And even that scientific reality, deposition of water vapor into ice, can be held in the mind as something deeply serene, because it reminds us that the air above us is always participating in the beauty below us. In low valleys, where cooler air settles like water in a bowl, dew and frost may linger longer, while on hillsides and under trees the pattern may change. And this is part of the atmosphere's quiet intimacy with landscape, the way it listens to shape and shade, to shelter and openness, to the softness of a lawn and the firmness of stone, arranging moisture differently from one place to the next with exquisite care. Perhaps you can imagine now a field before sunrise, still and pale, where a thin mist lies close to the earth, dew shining faintly on the grass, and the first frost tracing white along a fence rail, while above it all the troposphere rests in near silence, carrying only the faintest movement of air. And in that scene, there is no need to do anything, no need to think quickly, because the atmosphere itself is already telling the bedtime story, one of cooling and settling, one of moisture finding rest, one of the hidden becoming visible by degrees. This is why such small weather can feel so comforting, because it belongs to the gentlest edge of change, not storm, not thunder, not haste, but a quiet exchange between temperature, surface, and air. And in that exchange, the world seems to lower its voice for the sake of sleep. So as this calming narration drifts on, let your thoughts become like dew forming on grass, gathering slowly, lightly, and without effort, or like frost appearing on a cold window in patterns too delicate to force. And remember that even now, while you rest, the atmosphere may be carrying a little moisture over dark gardens and silent roads, preparing another soft dawn of silver droplets and pale crystalline light. And let that image accompany you toward deep sleep, toward softer breathing, toward the feeling that the whole world is cooling gently into stillness around you, held once more by the tender and invisible blanket of air, continuing in the same ultra-calm, long-form bedtime rhythm established for this project. This sleep story now settles even closer to the sleeping earth, where the atmosphere performs some of its smallest and most tender miracles in the quiet hours before dawn. As this gentle bedtime chapter unfolds, imagine the world growing still beneath a clear night sky, the air calm over gardens and fields and rooftops, the warmth of the day slowly drifting away from stones, leaves, and wooden fences until the ground begins to cool more quickly than the air above it. And in that simple and beautiful difference, the atmosphere begins another of its soft arrangements. Because when surfaces lose enough heat, the nearby air can also cool, and if it cools to the point where its moisture can no longer remain invisible, tiny droplets begin to appear, not with sound, not with urgency, but with a patience so complete that dew seems less like weather and more like a blessing placed delicately upon the land. This is one of the most relaxing facts in all the atmosphere, that water can gather out of air so quietly that a meadow may go to sleep dry and wake silvered. Each blade of grass holding a small round world of reflected moonlight, each petal resting beneath a clear bead so perfect it seems almost imagined. And in this nighttime story, dew becomes a reminder that the atmosphere is always carrying more than we see, more moisture, more softness, more hidden potential for calm transformation than daylight usually allows us to notice. When the air is moist and the night is gentle, dew forms because the temperature of the surface falls to the dew point, that peaceful threshold where water vapor condenses into liquid. And if you picture that process slowly, as though the earth itself were breathing out coolness while the sky watches over it, then even science begins to feel like lullaby language, because condensation is simply the moment when the invisible chooses to rest in visible form. Sometimes this happens first on smooth car roofs, on window panes, on broad leaves, or on quiet garden stones, because some surfaces cool more quickly than others. And this is another soft truth about the atmosphere, that even in one small place, one small backyard or field or village lane, the night air is in conversation with every texture beneath it, with metal, soil, wood, flower, and glass, responding gently to each. And when the night grows colder still, when the surface temperature slips below freezing, the atmosphere offers a different kind of tenderness, because frost can form, not as rain frozen after falling, but often as water vapor moving directly into delicate crystals of ice upon the cold ground. And there is something so calm and hushed about that process that it feels perfectly made for a relaxing story to fall asleep to. For frost does not arrive loudly. It does not rush in. It simply appears, feather by feather, edge by edge, until fields, branches, and rooftops wear a pale lace of white in the early dawn, before the first strong sunlight touches the land. Frost can make the ordinary world seem newly ceremonial, as though the atmosphere had spent the night embroidering each surface with fine silver stitching. And even that scientific reality, deposition of water vapor into ice, can be held in the mind as something deeply serene, because it reminds us that the air above us is always participating in the beauty below us. In low valleys, where cooler air settles like water in a bowl, dew and frost may linger longer, while on hillsides and under trees the pattern may change. And this is part of the atmosphere's quiet intimacy with landscape, the way it listens to shape and shade, to shelter and openness, to the softness of a lawn and the firmness of stone, arranging moisture differently from one place to the next with exquisite care. Perhaps you can imagine now a field before sunrise, still and pale, where a thin mist lies close to the earth, dew shining faintly on the grass, and the first frost tracing white along a fence rail, while above it all the troposphere rests in near silence, carrying only the faintest movement of air. And in that scene, there is no need to do anything, no need to think quickly, because the atmosphere itself is already telling the bedtime story, one of cooling and settling, one of moisture finding rest, one of the hidden becoming visible by degrees. This is why such small weather can feel so comforting, because it belongs to the gentlest edge of change, not storm, not thunder, not haste, but a quiet exchange between temperature, surface, and air. And in that exchange, the world seems to lower its voice for the sake of sleep. So as this calming narration drifts on, let your thoughts become like dew forming on grass, gathering slowly, lightly, and without effort, or like frost appearing on a cold window in patterns too delicate to force. And remember that even now, while you rest, the atmosphere may be carrying a little moisture over dark gardens and silent roads, preparing another soft dawn of silver droplets and pale crystalline light. And let that image accompany you toward deep sleep, toward softer breathing, toward the feeling that the whole world is cooling gently into stillness around you, held once more by the tender and invisible blanket of air, continuing in the same soft, serialized bedtime rhythm established by your sample script. We now wander inland toward quiet mountains and resting valleys, where the atmosphere moves with a slower kind of grace, shaped by slopes, cooled by height, and softened by distance. Imagine the night settled over a broad valley. The last of the evening light long faded from the ridges, the fields below wrapped in dim, silver-blue stillness, and above them, the lower atmosphere resting like a gentle blanket that has learned the shape of every hillside and stream. Because, in mountainous places, the air is never separate from the land beneath it, and this makes the science of the atmosphere feel especially tender, as though the sky were leaning close to listen to the earth. During the day, mountain slopes warmed by the sun can gently heat the air above them, and that air, becoming lighter, may drift upslope in what is known as a valley breeze, a slow daytime movement that feels less like wind and more like a quiet invitation upward, carrying warmth and sometimes moisture toward higher ground. And when enough moist air rises along a slope, it cools as pressure decreases, and this cooling can encourage cloud formation, so that mountain peaks may gather soft white crowns in the afternoon, not because they call storms in any dramatic way, but because the atmosphere responds faithfully to height, to cooling, and to the patient lifting of air. By night, the rhythm often reverses, because the mountain slopes lose heat after sunset. The air touching them cools and grows denser, and that cooler air can begin to slide gently downslope into the valley below in what is called a mountain breeze. And there is something deeply restful in that nightly descent, as though the mountains themselves were exhaling coolness into the dark, letting the valley fill slowly with calm, clear air that settles in low places and gathers there with extraordinary patience. This is one of the loveliest truths about the atmosphere in mountain country, that the shape of the land can guide the air into motions so subtle and rhythmic that an entire landscape seems to breathe, warming and lifting by day, cooling and settling by night. And if you imagine sleeping in a quiet cabin or in a village tucked between dark slopes, you can almost feel that invisible motion around you, not as disturbance, but as a natural lullaby, a circulation written by sunlight, stone, shadow, and time. Because temperature generally decreases with altitude in the lower atmosphere, mountain air often feels cooler and clearer than the air at lower elevations. And that cooling helps explain why high peaks may hold snow long after lower fields have turned green, why certain clouds cling to ridges, and why mornings in elevated places can feel so crisp and still, as if the atmosphere has been gently refined by the climb. When moist air is pushed upward over mountains, it may cool enough to condense into clouds and precipitation, making the windward side of a range greener and more cloud-kissed, while the leeward side can become drier in what is called a rain shadow. And even that scientific detail can be folded softly into this bedtime story, because it shows how carefully the atmosphere responds to form, how respectfully it changes as it crosses a ridge, giving cloud and rain to one side, clearer skies to the other, not randomly, but in patient response to slope and height. In some valleys, especially on calm nights, cooler air can collect so effectively that fog may form before dawn, lying low over meadows and riverbeds like a pale sleeping sea, while the higher slopes remain clear above it. And this sight, a valley filled with mist beneath quiet hills, may may be one of the atmosphere's most peaceful creations, because it reveals that even air can pool softly, can settle into hollows, can become layered and luminous without noise. There's great comfort in the idea that the atmosphere does not merely pass over mountains, but converses with them, that every ridge, forest, ravine, and open pasture shapes the movement of air in small and graceful ways, and that this conversation has been taking place for ages, through moonlit nights, cool dawns, and still afternoons, when clouds gather lazily over distant summits. So as this relaxing story continues, and you drift farther toward deep sleep, imagine the mountains breathing their cool nighttime breath into the valleys. Imagine the last warmth of day slipping gently upward from the slopes. Imagine cloud forming from lifted air and mist settling in low meadows before dawn. And let these quiet motions soothe you, because they are part of the same atmosphere that has carried us through the layers of the sky, through twilight and dew and sea breeze and rain, and now back to the sleeping land, where the contours of the earth shape the air into tenderness. Let your thoughts rest there for a while, among dark ridgelines and silver fog, where the world feels cradled by slope and sky together, and where the atmosphere, in all its invisible intelligence, continues to move without hurry, to cool without harshness, and to hold the night in a silence so gentle that even the mountains seem to sleep, continuing in the same slow, soothing long-form rhythm established for this project. This sleep story now settles into the softest kind of nighttime stillness, lingering close to the earth, where the air feels nearest, kindest, and most familiar. Imagine now not the highest layers of the atmosphere, nor the distant shimmer of auroras, nor even the broad wandering of winds over sea and mountain, but a quiet garden at night, a sheltered place of leaves and soil and sleeping flowers, where the atmosphere seems to lower its voice until it is barely more than a cool touch resting on the skin. Because one of the most relaxing facts about Earth's atmosphere is that it is always nearest to us in these small and intimate places, in courtyards, on balconies, beside open windows, above dark grass, between tree branches, and around the gentle rise and fall of every breath. And in this bedtime story, there is deep comfort in returning to that closeness, to the simple truth that the same vast atmosphere that encircles the whole planet also gathers quietly in the stillness of a single sleeping garden during the night, when sunlight is gone and surfaces begin to release the warmth they held through the day. The air close to the ground can cool and soften, and if the evening is calm enough, the atmosphere may become gently layered, with cooler air resting low and slightly warmer air above, creating a hush that feels almost protective, as though the garden had been tucked beneath a tender blanket of invisible calm. Leaves, stones, wooden fences, flower pots, and paths all give up heat at their own patient pace. And because each surface cools differently, the night air above them becomes a subtle mosaic of tiny temperature changes, too delicate to notice one by one. Yet together they shape the feeling of an outdoor night as surely as moonlight shapes shadow. And perhaps this is why a gentle bedtime walk, whether real or imagined, can feel so deeply soothing, because the atmosphere is not uniform there, but textured and alive in the quietest possible way. Somewhere in the dark, a leaf may be collecting dew. A patch of soil may still hold a trace of warmth from the afternoon. A stone step may cool faster than the grass beside it. And over all of it, the lower atmosphere rests like a patient listener, receiving moisture, carrying faint scents, and holding the chemistry of life in balance with no need for applause. The air you breathe in this relaxing story is mostly nitrogen and oxygen, with smaller traces of other gases, and a little water vapor shifting softly through the night. And while those proportions may sound like the language of science, tonight they can simply become the language of reassurance, because oxygen arrives quietly to the lungs, carbon dioxide leaves just as quietly, and each breath becomes part of an ancient exchange between the atmosphere and living things, between leaves and people, between sleeping trees and resting animals, between the darkened garden and the larger breathing world beyond it. This nighttime story is gentle because breathing itself is gentle, and the atmosphere makes that gentleness possible, surrounding every resting creature with an invisible reservoir of air, held close by gravity, refreshed by global circulation, and made tender by the coolness of evening. Even scent belongs to the atmosphere's calm work, because the faint perfume of flowers at night, the green smell of leaves, the earthy coolness of damp soil, and the almost silver freshness that comes just before dawn are all carried by moving air, by molecules drifting softly from one place to another. And so the atmosphere does not only hold clouds and wind and weather, it also carries the smallest signatures of place, the memory of rain on stone, the sweetness of jasmine, the quiet mineral scent of cooling pavement, the soft resin of wood, all of them folded into the night as delicately as breath itself. If there is a bench in this imagined garden, let it be cool but not cold. And if there is a path, let it be dim and pale beneath the moon. And if there are branches above, let them move only slightly, just enough to remind you that the atmosphere is never truly still, only very calm, always balancing, always adjusting, always shaping itself around the earth in patterns so subtle that they become a kind of natural calming narration. And perhaps that is why this sleep story, this bedtime story, this gentle bedtime drifting through atmospheric fact and quiet wonder, can help you fall asleep so easily, because it brings the mind back from everything large and demanding to something close and faithful. The air in the garden, the breath in the chest, the coolness near the grass, the softness around the leaves, the almost silence of a world settling deeper into night. Far above, the higher layers still exist in their graceful order, the stratosphere still keeping its quiet watch, the mesosphere still receiving the occasional meteor, the thermosphere still touched by faint solar energy, and the exosphere still loosening into space. Yet here below, where deep sleep begins, the atmosphere is content to be simple, breathable, and near. So let your thoughts rest in this moonlit garden now, where the air is calm enough to hear almost nothing at all, where each breath feels a little slower, where the night seems to gather gently around your body instead of asking anything from it, and where the invisible ocean of atmosphere becomes not a distant scientific idea, but a tender companion, cool above the grass, soft beside the flowers, present at the window, present at the pillow, present in every slow inhale and every softer exhale, until the mind itself becomes like night air over a sleeping garden, clear, quiet, and ready to disappear into rest. As this sleep story continues in its slow and unbroken calm, let us stay close to the quiet garden of night air and gently lift our eyes toward the sky above it, because one of the softest wonders of Earth's atmosphere appears after sunset, when moonlight and starlight pass through the invisible layers of air and are changed, softened, and scattered into the tender shades of night. And in this bedtime story, that change is not dramatic or sharp, but delicate, like silk drawn slowly across a lamp, because the atmosphere at night does not simply disappear when daylight is gone. It continues its patient work, shaping the darkness itself, dimming some edges, brightening others, carrying coolness downward, and turning the sky into a vast resting place for the mind. Imagine the moon rising above rooftops or trees, not in a blaze, but in a pale and steady glow. And consider how even that familiar light is part of a gentle scientific arrangement, for moonlight is really sunlight reflected from the lunar surface and then passed through Earth's atmosphere before it reaches the ground. And during that final passage, the air may soften it with faint haze, thin cloud, drifting moisture, or suspended dust, giving it a pearly quality that feels perfectly suited to a nighttime story, because the atmosphere receives the light and makes it quieter, calmer, and more dreamlike before laying it across fields, windows, sea water, and sleeping stone. Sometimes the moon appears larger and warmer near the horizon, glowing with a creamy gold or soft amber tone. And this, too, belongs to the atmosphere, because when the moon is low in the sky, its light travels through a longer path of air, allowing shorter wavelengths to scatter more and leaving the warmer tones more visible, much as sunset does with the sun. And there is deep comfort in that parallel, the thought that day and night are joined by the same atmospheric kindness, the same invisible filtering, the same patient turning of brilliant light into something gentler for human eyes. When the air carries a little moisture or fine mist, the moon may seem haloed, surrounded by a pale ring or soft, luminous blur. And halos can form when moonlight interacts with ice crystals high in thin clouds, making the sky look as though it has placed a faint silver circle around the moon, not as decoration, but as one more quiet result of geometry, light, and floating crystal. And perhaps that is one of the most relaxing facts in all the atmosphere, that beauty so often appears when ordinary physical rules are given enough space to unfold slowly. The stars, too, are touched by air, and when they seem to twinkle above a sleeping landscape, that twinkling often comes from the atmosphere itself, because layers of moving air with slightly different temperatures and densities can bend the starlight by tiny amounts as it travels downward, causing the stars to shimmer softly rather than shine with perfectly steady brightness. And in this relaxing story, that shimmer feels like the sky breathing in its sleep, each small flicker a reminder that the atmosphere, even when calm, is alive with subtle structure. On very still nights, when the air is clear and dry. The stars can seem sharper, the moon more precise, and the darkness deeper between them. While on hazier nights, the sky becomes milkier, and the light more diffuse, and both moods have their own comfort, because the atmosphere knows how to make the night beautiful in different voices. One crisp and crystalline, another veiled and tender, one full of quiet depth, another full of softened glow. Down near the Earth's surface, meanwhile, the ground continues to cool after sunset, releasing the day's stored warmth into the air and into space. And this nocturnal cooling often deepens the serenity of the lower atmosphere, allowing dew to gather, breezes to settle, and the air near the grass or stone path to feel slightly cooler than the air above, as though the whole world were slowly lowering itself into rest together. In a city, moonlight may catch on rooftops and pale walls, softened by a little haze above the streets, while in the countryside, it may spread over fields in broad silver bands, and by a shoreline, it may ripple over dark water, where the sea and atmosphere continue their wordless exchange of vapor and coolness. And in every setting, the same truth remains, that the night sky we love is never just above us, but also around us, because the atmosphere stands between the stars and our eyes, between the moon and the sleeping garden, translating distant light into intimate feeling. This is why a gentle bedtime chapter about the atmosphere can feel so deeply peaceful, because it reveals that even darkness is not empty, even moonlight is not simple, even starlight arrives with a history of travel and transformation, and all of it comes to rest at last in the quiet world around your bed, your window, your breath. So as you continue to fall asleep, imagine the atmosphere as a moonlit veil drawn softly over the earth, carrying faint silver light, a trace of coolness, the shimmer of distant stars, and the softness of night itself. And let that image loosen every remaining thought, until your mind becomes like the sky above a sleeping garden, dim, spacious, and tenderly illuminated, with nothing more to do now but drift, continuing in the same slow, soothing, serialized rhythm suggested by your sample script. We let this gentle bedtime story move toward the quiet threshold before morning, where the atmosphere begins to change once more with such tenderness that even waking light can feel like part of a dream. Now imagine the world in that delicate hour just before sunrise, when the night has not fully gone and the day has not fully arrived, and everything seems to rest inside a soft suspension, as though the earth itself were holding one long, peaceful breath, because this is one of the atmosphere's loveliest moments, the gradual return of light through cooling air, faint mist, sleeping trees, and silent rooftops. And in this relaxing story, there is no sudden beginning to morning, only a slow unfolding, only a pale and careful brightening far beyond the horizon, where sunlight is already touching the highest air long before the sun itself appears. Its light begins to meet the upper atmosphere, and there, in layers of air still invisible to most sleepy eyes, the first traces of dawn are scattered and softened, so that the dark sky lightens by degrees, not with urgency, but with patience. And perhaps that is why dawn can feel so calming, because it arrives the way deep sleep often arrives, gently, almost unnoticed, one soft layer at a time. The eastern sky may first turn from black to charcoal, then from charcoal to deep blue, and then to a lighter blue washed with silver or pearl. And each of these changes belongs to the atmosphere, to the same invisible ocean of air that has carried clouds, rain, moonlight, sea breeze, frost, and stars through this nighttime story. And now, in the calmest possible way, it receives the returning sun and translates its brightness into something tender enough for early morning fields, quiet windows, and half-dreaming minds. If a little moisture still lingers near the ground, perhaps as mist over a meadow or dew on a leaf, dawn will seem even softer, because tiny droplets in the air and on the earth can catch and scatter the new light, turning it into a hush of silver radiance. And then the world does not simply brighten, it glows, as if the atmosphere were lifting a veil very slowly from the face of the land. In some places, especially over grass or near still water, the coolest air of the night may remain close to the surface until the first warmth of morning begins to stir it. And this gives dawn its layered feeling, cool below, lighter above, with the atmosphere in the act of rearranging itself once again, preparing for another day of breezes, clouds, rising warmth, and the long, quiet circulation of air around the turning earth. Yet for our bedtime story, this early dawn is not a call to awaken, but a final soft chamber of calm, because even the science of morning can become a lullaby when it is told slowly enough, and the return of light can feel less like an interruption than like a gentle blanket changing color. Imagine now a field at first light, each blade of grass touched by dew, the horizon pale with a faint golden promise, and the air so still that every small sound seems wrapped in distance. And above it, all the troposphere rests in delicate balance, no longer in the deep cooling of midnight, not yet in the stirring warmth of full day, but in a beautiful middle state that feels perfectly suited to deep rest. Perhaps a thin cloud drifts high and takes on the softest rose color, or perhaps the sky remains clear, allowing the gradient of dawn to spread smoothly from horizon to height. But in either case, the atmosphere is doing what it has always done, scattering light, carrying moisture, balancing temperature, and shaping the emotional texture of the sky with quiet, scientific precision. There is something wonderfully reassuring in that. The idea that the beauty of dawn is not random, not fragile in the sense of being accidental, but dependable, created by the faithful meeting of sunlight and air over a planet that turns with serene regularity through night and morning and back again. And so, as this calming narration continues, let yourself remain just here in the almost morning, where nothing is rushed and nothing is demanded, where the sky is only beginning to brighten and the world still belongs mostly to silence, because this is a gentle bedtime place too, a place where thoughts can thin like mist, where worries can fade into pale blue distance, and where the atmosphere, from the nearest breath to the highest layer touched by dawn, continues to hold the earth with patient softness. Let the coming of light feel far away and slow. Let the coolness of the night still rest around you. Let the image of dew, pale sky, and sleeping fields settle in the mind like a final relaxing story within the larger sleep story. And if you are already drifting, then drift more deeply now, carried not by darkness alone, but by the soft first breathing of dawn through the atmosphere, until even the brightening world cannot reach you except as warmth, calm, and the faintest silver edge of a dream, continuing in the same gentle serialized cadence established for this project. This final chapter becomes a soft outro, letting the sleep story fade with calm slowness and the quiet scientific wonder that has guided the night from beginning to end. Now, dear listener, there is nowhere left to travel, nowhere higher to rise, and nowhere lower to drift, because we have already wandered through the layers of Earth's atmosphere, from the weather-filled troposphere to the fading edge of the exosphere, and then back again to dew, moonlight, mist, valleys, shorelines, gardens, and dawn. And so this bedtime story can now do what all the gentlest stories do. It can grow quieter, softer, and more spacious until it becomes less like narration and more like air itself, surrounding you lightly, asking nothing, holding everything. Imagine the whole earth resting beneath its invisible blanket of atmosphere, turning slowly in silence, wrapped in nitrogen, oxygen, water vapor, trace gases, drifting particles, soft pressure, and light. And think of how much this delicate envelope does without ever needing to be seen. How it scatters daylight into blue, how it warms and cools, how it carries clouds across oceans, how it turns vapor into mist, how it lays dew upon grass and frost upon windows, how it bends moonlight into halos and starlight into shimmer, how it receives meteors high above, and how it cradles every sleeping forest, sea, rooftop, hillside, and field below. This is the atmosphere's quiet greatness, not loud, not dramatic, not demanding, but endlessly faithful. And perhaps that is why it belongs so naturally in a relaxing story to fall asleep to, because it reminds us that the most essential forms of care are often the least visible, the least boastful, the most continuous, and the most calm. All night long, while you have been listening to this sleep story, the atmosphere has remained exactly what it always is, a patient structure of layers and motions, a living stillness, an unseen ocean resting around the planet, moving with breezes and pressure, and light so gradually that it becomes a kind of natural calming narration all its own. And now, in this final gentle bedtime passage, you do not need to remember every fact or every layer or every drifting cloud, because the mind at rest does not keep things by force. It keeps only the feeling of them, and the feeling here is softness, steadiness, shelter, and peace. So let all the science become simple now, simple as breath, simple as a cool room at night, simple as moonlight on a window, or the faint silver of dawn waiting somewhere beyond the horizon, because the atmosphere is, at heart, the great keeper of those small experiences, the reason a breeze can move a curtain, the reason rain can tap softly at the roof, the reason fog can gather in a valley, the reason the stars can twinkle, the reason each inhale comes so quietly, and each exhale can carry you farther toward deep sleep. And perhaps the most relaxing fact of all is this, that you have never spent a moment outside its care, not for a single second, because from your first breath to this very one, the atmosphere has been there, held gently to earth by gravity, renewed by cycles of air and water and light, surrounding you completely, whether you noticed it or not. And tonight, as this nighttime story fades, you may notice it just enough to feel comforted by it, just enough to feel how safe it is to be held by something so vast and so tender at once. Let your thoughts thin now like high cloud in evening. Let them settle like cool air in a valley. Let them soften like mist over grass. And if one last image remains, let it be this: the sleeping earth under its layered sky, oceans dark and calm, mountains blue with distance, gardens silvered with dew, the upper air faintly touched by starlight, and above all of it, the atmosphere continuing its ancient work in perfect quiet. No effort is needed from you now. No more following, no more remembering, no more doing, only resting, only floating, only allowing the words to become slower and dimmer until they are scarcely words at all. Only the hush of a bedtime story becoming a gentle bedtime silence. This relaxing story has carried you through clouds, light, temperature, wind, pressure, moonlight, dew, coastlines, mountains, gardens, and dawn. And now it leaves you somewhere even softer than all of those places, somewhere inward and still, where breathing is easy, where the body feels heavy and warm, where the mind no longer reaches outward, and where sleep can arrive the way the atmosphere does its work, gradually, invisibly, and with complete kindness. So rest now beneath the soft blanket of air, beneath the calm sky, beneath the science and the silence and the slow turning of the earth, and let the final thought be the gentlest one of all, that the world is being held and you are in it. And that is enough. That is more than enough for this moment, for this breath, for this deep and peaceful falling away into sleep.